François Mitterrand in 1957 predicted that without Africa, France would not have any position in the 21st century. He was quite categorical that France could only have any position in the 21st century if it maintained its control over African former colonies. Similarly, in 2008, President Jacques Chirac re-echoed the prophecy that, without Africa, France will be relegated to the rank of a third power. According to Xavier Renaud,
France withdraw its troops from their country. They say the former colonial power has failed to protect them from armed groups.
If France was our partner, it was supposed to help us fight against terrorism. But since 2016, there has been no change. We think France doesn't deserve Burkina Faso's trust.
Now its military rulers have reportedly suspended the 2018 security accord with Paris.
If all of Africa could come together, if the entire continent could come together. But our reality is, because of the stronghold that France has on Africa, France can destabilize any of its former colonies with the push of a button. So the reality is, trying to push back against France is mission impossible at this time, which is why we are very pleased that finally the African heads of states were able to come together and agreed on what we are calling the African Continental Free Trade Area. You got to understand, back in 1963, when our Pan-African leaders came together and created the Organization of African Unity, they were trying to undo the damage done by the Berlin Conference. But unfortunately, when they went to Addis Ababa, they were divided. We had the Casablanca group, who were Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. They were outnumbered by the others, who were the nationalists, who said, let's go slow. The Casablanca group, who said, Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad, African Union now. Had we won, had the Casablanca group won in 1963, Africa would be in a very different place, because all these borders would have been eliminated back then. They came up with a compromise, which we are calling Organization of African Unity. Year in, year out, for 55 years. The African heads of states met. The issue of an Africa speaking with one voice, one continent, one Africa was tabled. And year in and year out, we failed to reach consensus until last year, March 2018, when they finally agreed that enough is enough. Africa must speak with one voice. Africa must enter the world stage as one customs union, as one continent, speaking with one voice. That is the only way that Africa can begin to take her rightful place on the world stage. So it's been a lengthy process, thanks to the legacy of colonization. It seems to me that this should have been a slam dunk. It's common sense. But because of interferences from former colonizers that just kept getting in the way. You look, for example, now West Africa is trying to have the West African echo and have one currency.
Africa's relationship with France has shaped politics, economics, and security across large parts of the continent for more than half a century. What began as colonial rule evolved into a dense web of military agreements, monetary arrangements, corporate dominance, and diplomatic influence that outlasted formal independence for decades. This system appeared stable and unshakable. Today, it is visibly fracturing. Across West, Central, and parts of North Africa, governments, institutions, and societies are deliberately dismantling structures that once tied their economies and sovereignty to Paris. This shift is not sudden, emotional, or symbolic. It is structural, strategic, and rooted in hard lessons learned over generations. The foundation of France's post-colonial influence rested on continuity. Independence did not mean economic separation. French companies retained control over key sectors such as mining, energy, telecommunications, banking, ports, and transport. Defense agreements ensured French troops remained stationed across Africa under the banner of security cooperation. Diplomatic alignment was reinforced through international forums. Perhaps most importantly, monetary dependence was institutionalized through currency systems that linked several African economies directly to the French treasury. This architecture allowed France to project influence at relatively low cost while maintaining access to resources and political leverage. For many African states, this arrangement initially offered stability. Access to European markets, military backing, and financial guarantees provided predictability in the early post-independence years. Over time, however, the costs became increasingly clear. Economic models centered on raw material exports left countries vulnerable to price swings and external shocks. Industrialization stalled. Youth. Unemployment surged. Decision-making authority remained constrained. When security deteriorated, promised protection often failed to deliver lasting results. Disillusionment spread quietly at first, then openly. The turning point came as African societies became more connected, informed, and assertive. Demographic change played a crucial role. A new generation, unburdened by colonial-era narratives, began questioning why political independence had not translated into economic dignity. Social media, independent journalism, and regional dialogue amplified these questions. Historical grievances resurfaced, not as nostalgia, but as evidence in a broader argument about agency and control. Economic realities accelerated the shift. Despite decades of partnership rhetoric, many African countries remained exporters of raw materials and importers of finished goods. Value chains were externalized. Infrastructure development often served extraction rather than domestic integration. Profits flowed outward when crises hit, such as commodity downturns or security emergencies. The asymmetry of the relationship became unmistakable. Promises of reform repeatedly fell short of expectations. In response, African governments began recalibrating their strategies. The first visible changes occurred in the security sphere. Military partnerships that had defined regional stability were reassessed. Where foreign troops failed to contain insurgencies or improve local capacity, their presence became politically untenable. Several governments chose to redefine or terminate long-standing defense arrangements, asserting that sovereignty could not coexist with permanent external command over security decisions. This was not a rejection of cooperation, but a demand for partnerships aligned with national priorities rather than inherited frameworks. Economic policy followed a similar path. Mining contracts signed decades earlier were reviewed, renegotiated, or revoked. Governments questioned royalty structures, environmental responsibilities, and local employment requirements. In many cases, the issue was not foreign participation itself, but the imbalance of benefit. New legislation emphasized domestic processing, local ownership, and technology transfer. This marked a departure from extractive models designed to feed external industries at minimal cost. Currency reform became one of the most symbolic and consequential arenas of change. Monetary systems that limited policy flexibility and tied reserves to foreign oversight came under intense scrutiny. Economists, civil society groups, and policymakers argued that true development required control over monetary tools. Moves toward reform, replacement, or diversification of currency arrangements reflected a broader desire for economic autonomy. These debates were no longer confined to academic circles. They entered mainstream political discourse. Trade diversification further weakened France's traditional leverage. African countries expanded commercial ties with Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and intra-African markets. Infrastructure investments facilitated new trade routes. The African Continental Free Trade Area provided a framework for reducing dependence on former colonial markets by strengthening regional supply chains. As export destinations diversified, the political cost of displeasing any single partner diminished. Cultural and diplomatic shifts reinforced these economic changes. African states began asserting independent positions in global forums, refusing automatic alignment with European stances. Votes at international institutions reflected national interests rather than historical loyalties. Cultural policy emphasized local languages, history, and identity. Educational reforms questioned curricula that centered European narratives at the expense of African experiences. These changes reshaped how societies understood their past and envisioned their future. Public opinion played a decisive role. Protests against foreign influence were not orchestrated by governments alone. They emerged from grassroots frustration. Communities affected by environmental damage, economic exclusion, or security failures demanded accountability. In many cases, France became the symbol of a broader system perceived as exploitative. While this symbolism sometimes oversimplified complex realities, it underscored a deep desire for dignity and self-determination. France's response struggled to keep pace with the speed and depth of change. Attempts to reframe relationships through new terminology or initiatives were often met with skepticism. Words without structural reform failed to restore trust. Economic offers that resembled past arrangements were rejected. Security proposals that preserved asymmetrical command structures lost credibility. The gap between intent and perception widened. At the same time, Africa's breaking free did not mean replacing one dependency with another. While new partners emerged, African leaders increasingly emphasized strategic pluralism. The goal was not to shift allegiance, but to expand options. By engaging multiple partners across sectors, countries reduced vulnerability and increased bargaining power. This multipolar approach reflected lessons learned from decades of over-reliance on a single external power. The consequences of this transformation are profound. France's economic footprint in parts of Africa has diminished. Its diplomatic influence is no longer assumed. Military presence has contracted, corporate dominance faces competition. More importantly, Africa's internal confidence has grown. Governments feel empowered to say no, renegotiate terms, and define development on their own terms. This confidence is uneven and contested, but it marks a clear departure from the past. Challenges remain significant. Breaking free from entrenched systems is complex. Capacity gaps, governance issues, and external pressures persist. Not all alternatives have delivered immediate benefits. Some transitions have been turbulent, yet even setbacks are now framed as internal problems to solve, not reasons to revert to dependency. This psychological shift may be the most enduring change of all. The transformation also forces a broader reckoning with how post-colonial relationships are defined in the modern world. Influence based on historical privilege is increasingly incompatible with societies that demand reciprocity and respect. Partnerships that fail to adapt risk irrelevance. Africa's experience illustrates that sovereignty is not a static condition achieved at independence, but an ongoing process shaped by choices, institutions, and collective will. In conclusion, Africa's break from France's grip is not an act of hostility, nor a rejection of cooperation. It is a recalibration rooted in experience, driven by necessity, and sustained by a growing belief in self-determination. Decades of structural imbalance produced lessons that can no longer be ignored. As African nations assert control over security, currency, resources, and diplomacy, they are redefining their place in the world. This moment represents more than a regional realignment. It signals a broader shift in global relations, where historical hierarchies give way to negotiated partnerships. Africa's trajectory demonstrates that freedom is not declared once and secured forever. It is built, contested, and renewed through deliberate action. The era of automatic influence is ending. In its place emerges a continent increasingly confident in shaping its own destiny. The momentum behind Africa's break from France's long-standing grip did not stop with policy shifts or symbolic gestures. It moved deeper into institutions, markets, and everyday economic behavior, where influence is hardest to reclaim once lost. As old structures weakened, new ones began to take shape, not perfectly or uniformly, but with a clear direction that pointed away from dependency and toward autonomy. One of the most significant developments has been the reconfiguration of economic planning. For decades, development strategies in many African states were shaped externally, guided by models that prioritized stability for foreign partners over resilience for domestic populations. Budget frameworks were often constrained by external expectations. Investment priorities reflected donor preferences. As tis loosened, governments gained greater latitude to experiment. Industrial policies once dismissed as unrealistic returned to the table. Local manufacturing, food security, and regional supply chains became central goals rather than secondary ambitions. This shift altered how African economies responded to shocks. In the past, downturns in European demand reverberated directly through African export sectors, triggering fiscal crises and austerity measures. As trade diversified and regional markets expanded, these shocks became less devastating. While vulnerability did not disappear, exposure became more balanced. Economic survival no longer hinged on a single external relationship. The financial sector also evolved. Banks that once prioritized servicing multinational firms and extractive industries began expanding credit to domestic enterprises. Regional development banks gained prominence. New financial instruments supported infrastructure, agriculture, and small manufacturing. Although capital constraints remained, decision-making authority increasingly rested within African institutions rather than foreign capitals. Education and skills development reflected this transformation. Curricula shifted toward technical, scientific, and entrepreneurial training aligned with domestic needs. Partnerships emphasized capacity building rather than perpetual reliance on external expertise. The aim was not isolation, but competence. Over time, this reduced the justification for foreign control over key sectors under the pretext of technical superiority. Urban development further illustrated the change. Cities that once functioned primarily as administrative outposts or extraction hubs began repositioning themselves as centers of production, innovation, and regional trade. Investments in transport, energy, and digital infrastructure supported this evolution. The result was a gradual rebalancing of economic geography, with growth spreading beyond narrow enclaves tied to foreign interests. The cultural dimension of this break cannot be overstated. For generations, influence operated not only through contracts and troops, but through narratives. Success was often defined externally. Validation came from foreign approval. As Africa asserted greater autonomy, these narratives weakened. Cultural production, media, and public discourse increasingly emphasized African agency, competence, and historical context. This reshaping of identity reinforced political and economic change. France's declining influence also exposed a broader truth about power in the modern world. Influence sustained by inertia eventually erodes. When conditions change, Africa's demographic growth, technological adoption, and geopolitical relevance created conditions that the old system could not accommodate. Attempts to preserve influence without reform accelerated its decline. In contrast, partnerships that adapted to Africa's evolving priorities found space to remain relevant. Importantly, Africa's shift did not result in uniform outcomes. Different countries moved at different speeds and with varying degrees of success. Some faced transitional instability, others struggled to replace lost revenues or security arrangements. Yet even where challenges persisted, the direction of travel remained consistent, the willingness to confront these challenges internally rather than defer to external control marked a fundamental change in mindset. This transition also reshaped Africa's role in global negotiations. Whether on climate, trade, or security, African positions grew more coordinated and assertive. Collective bargaining increased leverage. Refusal to accept unfavorable terms became more common. This assertiveness sometimes generated friction, but it also commanded respect. Partners accustomed to deference were forced to adjust. France, for its part, faced a strategic dilemma. Rebuilding trust required acknowledging past imbalances and offering genuinely equal partnerships. This demanded changes not only in policy, but in perception. Influence could no longer be assumed. It had to be earned through mutual benefit, transparency, and respect for sovereignty. Where such changes were slow or incomplete, Africa moved on. The broader implications extend beyond France alone. Africa's experience serves as a case study in how post-colonial relationships evolve when underlying assumptions collapse. It demonstrates that political independence without economic control is incomplete. It also shows that dependency is not inevitable. Given time, information, and alternatives, societies reassess relationships that no longer serve them. As Africa continues this process, the focus increasingly turns inward. Governance, accountability, and inclusive growth become central concerns. Breaking free from external dominance creates space, but it also transfers responsibility. Success depends on how effectively African institutions manage this autonomy. The conversation shifts from blame to performance. The long-term trajectory suggests a continent redefining itself as a participant rather than a subject in global affairs. This does not mean the end of cooperation with Europe or France. It means cooperation on new terms. Partnerships based on extraction and control give way to those based on shared interest and negotiated value. In conclusion, Africa's break from France's grip represents one of the most consequential geopolitical and economic realignments of the post-colonial era. It is the result of accumulated experience, generational change, and strategic reassessment. The process is ongoing, uneven, and complex, but its direction is unmistakable. Africa is no longer content with inherited structures that limit its potential. By reclaiming control over security, resources, currency, and policy, African nations are asserting a form of sovereignty that extends beyond flags and anthems. This sovereignty is practical, institutional, and future-oriented. The era in which influence was preserved by history alone is ending. In its place emerges a world where relevance depends on reciprocity and adaptability. Africa's journey illustrates that freedom is not a moment but a process. And that process, once firmly underway, reshapes not only the continent itself, but the global order around it.